You see, he shall be called the prophet of the highest. He shall go before the face of the Lord to prepare his ways. Now, verse 78, through the tender mercy of our God, whereby the day spring from on high hath visited us. He knew that the Messiah was in their midst, to give light to them that sit in darkness and in the shadow of death, to guide our feet into the way of peace. Now that is a promise that God had made through Malachi, and he'd also made it through Isaiah. Verse 80, and the child grew and waxed strong in spirit, and he was in the deserts till the day of his showing unto Israel. John the Baptist was a very unusual person. We've seen that already in the other two Gospels, and we'll continue to see it as we go along. Now, as we come today, friends, to the second chapter of the Gospel of Luke, we have here the record of the birth of the Lord Jesus. Now, you'll recall that when we began this study, I made certain statements, and one of the statements was that this Gospel has a twofold purpose. It's a historical record, and you're going to note that in this chapter in a very definite way. It was written actually for the Greek, directed to him in particular, and for that reason it was written to the thinking man, and it also has a great spiritual purpose, and that's to present the Son of God. And so today we have an opportunity to look at that in a very definite way, and I promise to give you a quotation or two along this line to back up these statements. I want to go back and quote from Neander, one of the great saints of the past, and he made this statement, and I'm quoting now: the three great historical nations had to contribute, each in its own peculiar way, to prepare the soil for the planting of Christianity. The Jews on the side of the religious element, the Greeks on the side of science and art, the Romans as masters of the world on the side of the political element. So that we've seen in Matthew and in Mark and in Luke that each one of these Gospels were directed to a particular segment of humanity, of the human race. Matthew to the Jew, Mark to the Roman, and now Luke to the Greek. And again, it is Dr. Gregory who wrote, the Greeks are clearly distinguished from the other great historic races by certain marked characteristics. They were the representatives of reason and humanity in the ancient world. They looked upon themselves as having the mission of perfecting man. They were the cosmopolites of that age. They made their gods in the likeness of man, in their own likeness, and therefore joined to human culture utter worldliness and godlessness. And they had, you remember, that altar to an unknown god that Paul called their attention to. Paul was the proper one to go there to Athens and go into Greece and preach this gospel that Luke had written about here in this gospel. And of course, Dr. Luke was along with him. Dr. Luke, evidently a Gentile. Now, there is something else that probably we should say concerning the Greek mission was thus evidently a part of the preparation for the coming of the Lord Jesus into the world. It forced the thinking man of that age to feel and confess the insufficiency of human reason, even in its most perfect development, for the deliverance and perfection of mankind, and it left them waiting and longing for one who could accomplish this work. Now, Dr. Luke is getting ready, beginning here with chapter 2, having given us this preface and this introduction, to present the Lord Jesus from his birth to his death, to his resurrection, and to the ascension back into heaven and the promise of his coming again. Dr. Luke covers a great deal of ground for us that's important. Actually, the thing that the Greek accomplished was to give a language that became the vehicle for getting the word out. It communicated the gospel to the world, was the Greek language. And God used that man, Alexander the Great, to do that. And Howson says of Alexander, he says he took up the meshes of the net of civilization, which were lying in disorder on the edges of the Asiatic shore, and spread them over all the countries which he traversed in his wonderful campaigns. The East and West were suddenly brought together. Separated tribes were united under a common government. New cities were built as the centers of political life. New lines of communication were opened as the channels of commercial activity. The new culture penetrated the mountainous ranges of Pisidia and Lycaonia. The Tigris and Euphrates became Greek rivers. The language of Athens was heard among the Jewish colonies of Babylonia, and a Grecian Babylon was built by the conqueror in Egypt and called by his name. And of course that was Alexandria, a great city in Egypt then and even down to the present day. Now we find, with that kind of a background, we should look now at the birth of the Lord Jesus. And notice these things we've mentioned, that this man sticks close to history, and Sir William Ramsay found out he was very accurate in every statement he made. I'm reading now Luke 2, beginning with verse 1. And it came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. Now somebody says, gracious, were they taxing America in those days? No, my friend, but it says all the world. But the interesting word that is used here is the Greek word oikumene. It means inhabited earth, and it means the civilized world of that day. And you know, we weren't civilized in those days. Most of us had ancestors in northern Europe, and they weren't even included in this, although Caesar Augustus would love to have taxed everybody if he could have got to them, and he would have. Now, who is this man, Caesar Augustus? Well, he was an adopted son of Julius Caesar. His name actually was Octavius, and he took the name Caesar. I think he had a right to it, and it was a name that was sort of like the name Cadillac. It had prestige, and he took that name. Now, Augustus was not a name at all, but a title. When the Senate submitted to him certain titles, one, by the way, was king, and another emperor, and another was dictator, and he didn't like that term. But he took the name or the title of Augustus. Now, you'll notice that Augustus has a religious significance with it. He attempted to deify himself and make himself God. And here is a man, and I think this is remarkable, and Dr. Luke didn't say this accidentally. Caesar Augustus, he signed the tax bill, and he said the whole world in that day must be taxed. And he said that this is the thing that's got to take place. I need money to raise my army and keep my army in the field. I need money to live in luxury. And so he made this decree that the world should be taxed. And notice now, this taxing was first made when Cyrenius was governor of Syria. Notice that historical reference? And all went to be taxed, every one, into his own city. Now, Joseph also went up from Galilee out of the city of Nazareth into Judea under the city of David, which is called Bethlehem. And friends, you couldn't say it any better than that. He came out of Galilee. The town was Nazareth. He went into Judea, was the city of David, and it's called Bethlehem. And the reason he did all of this was because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be taxed with Mary. Why did she have to go to Bethlehem? Because she happens to be of the lineage of David also. To be taxed with Mary, his espoused wife, being great with child. Now this is, to me,